Okay, so this video we are going to be constructing the bodice. So I am doing a front opening round neck. So in your instructions when you're following them, the steps are quite similar, but what I'm going through today is very specific to the front opening round neck option. So the first thing that I think is worth talking about is that the first step in the instruction is to do a stay stitch. Now, when you're using twill, it's probably not as critical as when you're doing a rayon, really lightweight. However, I would always recommend doing it because it does give that bit of stabilization. So what that involves is doing a single stitch about 6 mil or 1/4 inch from the edge, just along these curved bits of the neckline, and it just stops it from stretching when you are putting the facings on and finishing the garment. So I'm going to go ahead and put a stay stitch on the front curves of the front bodice and along the back of the neck of the back bodice. All right, so now we're going to join our shoulders for our front bodice and our back bodice. Now, this dress consists of French seams. So unlike traditional, well, not traditional, but unlike other methods where you would do the print sides together and sew it together or overlock it, we are doing French seams, which means you want your wrong sides together. So your neckline is here, and then we've just done our neckline here, and we're wanting to attach our shoulders together. Now, when you're doing French seams, the biggest thing to stop from having any issues is making sure that your seam allowance is correct. I mean, you should be doing that anyway, but sometimes we get a bit freestyle. So you want to make sure that you are sewing this shoulder seam only a 6 mil or 1/4 inch seam allowance along the top. And then once we're done, we're going to trim it and turn it. This is quite a narrow seam allowance, so if you are not comfortable with narrow seam allowances, you will need to cut your pattern pieces additional to cater for that, but you are only trimming it back anyway, so it's not really required. But if you are unsure or uncomfortable with your narrow seam allowances, then that is something that you can alter when you're actually initially cutting out your pattern. We want to trim this if there's some excess. With that amount of seam allowance, there's really very little to trim. The instructions say to trim half of it, so that would only be about 3 mil. So now what we want to do is we want to turn and we want to press the seams towards the back. So press that towards the back of the dress. Now that that's pressed, you're wanting to pull the front bodice forward, and you want to press this seam again completely against the seam and iron that down, press it down. Okay, now we have pressed our shoulder seams. we now want to sew 6mm in, which will encase what we've just trimmed and also create the French seam. So now we have created a French seam. So on the outside it looks finished, and on the inside it also looks finished. So next step is our facings. Now in the pattern, your facing pieces require your front facing, or your back will look semi-similar if you're doing the snaps or buttons. So you need your front and your back facing. If you're doing a button or snap opening, you will have 2 pieces, otherwise you will have a piece on the fold. You may also opt to do your binding pieces instead. You also need to have interfacing. Now, because I'm going to use, I haven't decided if I'm going to use buttons or snaps yet, but I've chosen to use a solid PUL for the placket, which is this piece here, because I just find that it gives a really solid backing that allows your snaps to last a lot longer. So instead of having an iron-on interfacing here, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to overlock the edge of this, and this is the same method you'd use if you have a sew-on interfacing. I'm going to overlock along here. You can also sew. I'm also going to baste along here. However, that's just to stop it from flipping around. It is actually going to be sewn into the garment, whereas the edge here is not going to be sewn into the garment. With the back facing, however, because it's not going to have any buttons or snaps on it, I'm just using non-woven interfacing just to add that stability. So I'll go and iron that on and interface and overlock the white PUL to these pieces now. Okay, so now we have our pieces together. We want to put our right sides together. We're not French seaming these, so you want the right sides here. Don't worry about any overhang, that's all going to be sewn out anyway. So you want to connect your top of your shoulder piece of your back facing to your front facing along the shoulder seam, and you want to do the same here on your other side. You can also finish this with an overlock too. Because I've overlocked this already, I'm going to just quickly go and do this now so that that's already done. But if you've done just a normal interfacing for the whole lot, then you can do that all in one go so that it's nicely finished before it goes onto the garment. So if you don't have an overlocker, you can do all of this without the overlocker. You just use an overlocking stitch, which most domestic sewing machines have. They will look something like these ones here, 7 and 8 on my machine. Quite a few of these will be an overcast that you can use, but if you've got an overlocker, then that's perfect. Now we want to connect the shoulders together with a 12mm or 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now you just want to press the seam to the back, and you can also overlock that if you prefer, but you are not going to see it. Now I'm just going to trim all my excess threads here because they start to get in the way. Okay, so Now we are going to attach our facing, which looks a bit like this, to our bodice. So you want to get your shoulder seams and align them with your shoulder seams on your bodice. And now you just want to pin everything along here, noting that your facing seam and your bodice seam should be opposite directions. The instructions say to have it have your facing piece forward and your bodice piece backwards, but in my experience it doesn't make a huge difference which way it goes, but the instructions do say to do it the opposite way to the way that I am doing it. Okay, so now we are going to stitch along this whole neckline and placket using a 6mm seam allowance. When you get to this corner piece, if you haven't done corner sewing on a garment or accessory before, what you want to do is you want to sew up to about 6mm to the end. Keep your needle inside your stitching. Lift your foot, leaving the needle in so your fabric stays put, and then drop your foot again and you'll get a lovely sharp corner. So now that that is all stitched in place, you're wanting to trim along the curved parts and also just trim off the corner here. Now you're wanting to open this up and you're wanting to press towards your facing. If you have something like this happen where one of your basting stitches comes through, just snip it off. Pretend like it was never there. It has served its purpose. So you're wanting to press this towards the seam in towards the facing so that it is able to be understitched. Okay, that has been pressed. So what we're wanting to do is we want to understitch the whole of the facing, but we won't be able to get all the way into the edge here, so don't stress too much. You just go as far as you can into that corner. So remember, you're wanting to catch the inside seam that you've just clipped and pressed. So now we have a lovely neat understitch along the back here. Your next step is to stitch your shoulder seam of your facing and your garment together. Now you are going to do that inside your seam here, so it's not going to be visible. So your seams may not actually match up perfectly because perfection is not what we're aiming for here. So make sure you do this with your outside of your skirt facing out so that you can aim your needle right into that ditch there. For anyone who has done quilting before, this is called stitching in the ditch. Manually wind your needle down so that you hit right in the ditch there, and sew down the shoulder seam to the end of the facing. So as you'll see, it is barely visible here. A probably could have got even closer, but you won't see that once you're wearing a garment. You can also potentially get a better color match. I'm just using white for this tutorial, but that's not going to be visible. So I'm just going to do the other side and then trim as well. Now you do also have the option in the pattern, if you would like, you can stitch down your facing. So you can stitch along the edge of the facing, so you will have about 1.5 inches seam sort of instead around there, which I have done before, but in this instance I'm really happy with the way that the shoulder and the snaps will keep it down. So your next thing to kind of semi-finish this off is you want to get your placket. Now there is a right and a wrong way to do this technically, however you will probably notice if you have ever paid any attention to my makes that they are very inconsistent with which side we do it. But we want when you're wearing it, your left side, which when you're looking at it is your right side, underneath your opposite side. Make sure you have pushed these corners well and truly out. I've done not a great job of doing there. And what we're doing here is we are basting the bottom. So you're wanting to baste your placket here. So I'm just going to pin that and clip that together here. And in this instance, to ensure that I am keeping it nice and flush all the way down, I'm actually going to use some actual pins, which is a very rare occurrence for me. And I'm just going to pin the placket in a couple of spots as well. And I'm just going to baste these two pieces here. So now your bottom of your bodice is attached. Your facing is in. And we have what resembles a bodice. So if you're doing buttonholes, I actually prefer to do the buttonholes before I baste this together, or definitely before I attach it to the skirt. I just find if I'm doing it once the skirt's on, there's way more fabric. I find it harder to kind of get the bottom button in place. So what I'm gonna do for this option is I'm just going to use snaps. That also is just actually easier for my daughter. I may glue buttons on the top so that it has a button effect but not actually adding the buttons. But if you are wanting to do the buttonholes, you can do that at this point or just before this step, just to make it a little bit easier on yourself. It's the last step in the pattern instructions, but I personally find it best to do it at this point. The snaps, however, can wait until the end. But that has been our bodice construction. Stay tuned for the next video.